for someone like me who first came here in 1982, went to the Northern Territories, if I remember right, and our Australian soldier escort put us in a Land Rover, and then we proceeded to go like it was 100 kilometers an hour across the Northern Territories to today. Really fascinating for me to see 4 decades of that. This institute, really a fascinating place, and I'll start by thanking you for probably 9 or 10 or maybe years of guiding them. We're just saying the openness that comes along with that. I haven't been here in 2 years, 3 years, which is really a long time to not come to Australia, but it sure is good to be back. This institute, and there are only a handful of them that I've had the privilege of joining here, paints a view of the strategic landscape. I think it's rare and wholesome. Also very, very good for me. And on our side, on the U.S. side, the National Defense Strategy for the U.S. recently signed by the President. I think for someone like me who watched the 2018 version for us and now the current one, a lot of common areas between them, which tells you, even despite a change in administration, a common sort of path ahead for us, and the focus on deterrence, the focus on maintaining an enduring sort of competitive advantage, an acknowledgement of the need to campaign long-term to achieve the objectives that collectively we all have. A lot of common touch points there, so for us, I think good that it doesn't take us in a hard direction left or right, and I think our partners will see it the same way. The Ukraine conflict has a lot of folks' attention, rightfully so, but for someone like me who spent half of my career out here, it does not change the focus on what is our pacing challenge and our primary theater as a Marine Corps and as a Navy, and that's the Indo-Pacific. Lots to learn out of that conflict, near term and longer. We'll see what that portends going forward. Today, all day, a great set of discussions with Australian leaders who I've known for a decade or more. And I would just offer in all humility, who have provided me insights, who have mentored me in a way that probably isn't familiar with a lot of people, but from General Campbell through the rest of the team, just a great day. Because when you already have an established personal relationship, you can start a conversation, a dialogue at another level. It's not introductory comments. You don't need a piece of paper. You just start talking and go up. We are making a fair amount of changes in the Marine Corps, in our structure, in our posture, in our warfighting concepts, in our training, in how we manage our people. All of that in order to make sure that we stay in front of the change that is happening around the world, because as a service chief, we have 2 responsibilities. One, to make sure we provide the forces today for a conflict, but also to make sure that 5-10 years from now, we're in the right spot and we have done the investments we have made the investments in the right places so that the future is in a good place. So we are in that tension all the time between this afternoon and the future. I'll highlight the close cooperation between the U.S. Marine Corps and the Australian Defence Force, just for a moment. From experimentation through Darwin, the exercises, the rotational deployments that are there, all that had been going on for 7 or 8 years, but now, especially on the experimentation and wargaming to a much deeper level, that I think benefits both of us. Because at the speed, the velocity at which I feel like we have to learn and adjust, you can't do it alone. So the partnership there, I would say, just phenomenal. I mentioned some of the leaders. And for me, I'll just finish up by saying it's personal. I met General Berger in Quantico decades ago. General Campbell, probably during my first couple of visits here. That close relationship, I would tell you, as a Marine, as a warfighter, translates directly into combat, where there is unquestioned trust between our two services. I would just leave it there. And that's borne out for me, particularly in Iraq, Afghanistan, other places where, without hesitation, especially in the bad moments and really tough fights, you were almost arguing who's going to get on the helicopter first, in other words. If you had 20 minutes to get out, to launch a reaction force to get to a bad problem, they were going to be at the helicopter probably before you were. Don't need anything else. They were just, that level of trust is really close. I'll just finish up before we take it, and I'm going to keep my notes here so I can make sure I get the questions down. But lastly, just above the Marine Corps, just the military to military and nation to nation relationship. In my own personal opinion, nothing more. We don't, this level of relationship, there's nothing above that for the U.S., for me, for the U.S. military. No level of trust is higher. No level of cooperation is greater. The openness, which we share everything from intelligence to the next warfighting concept, there isn't any barrier, any folder that we can't show you sort of approach. It's completely open. That's just decades of being side by side. We should never take that for granted, I would just say. And we don't. I don't. And I'll turn it back to you,
General,
sir.
thank you. Just thinking of the benefits of personal contacts, we had hosted a discussion in ASPI yesterday of a team of lieutenant colonels from the Maldives. The lead of whom was a young chap who had done his training at Quantico. And so they were in Australia because they're producing not their first, but their second defence white paper after a decade of absence. A really fascinating discussion, but there's a nice connection. So a Marine-trained Maldivian lieutenant colonel comes to Australia to talk about how they can produce a defence white paper. I mean, those sorts of connections I think are really fantastic, and really something that only the decent democracies can offer, if I can put it that way. But let's get to some discussion first, General. The Corps has its own modernisation plan, which I believe is Force 2030, Force Design 2030. Can you share with us what some of the high points of that are? What is it that you need to change the Marine Corps from, and what is it that you're attempting to change it to?
For almost 20 years, not quite, but almost 20 years, the Marine Corps, invested heavily into the operations in the Middle East because that's what our country needed us to do, and we're very good at that. And because the Marine Corps has all of the air and ground and it is the whole package, it's a natural fit for that. So that became not our only focus, but a large part of it for a couple decades. Long-term, though, beyond the Middle East conflicts, our value to the joint force, to the U.S. military joint force, is as a naval expeditionary element that's forward all the time, that can both collect, gather information, prevent an adversary from doing the same, can open the door to places, can reassure partners and allies all the time, and do it in a naval region, maritime region. So for us, it's sort of not new. Some of it is back to our roots, where we came from. Because going forward, I think that is what we need to do to contribute to our strategy. So we have to adjust our structure some. We have to adjust the way that we train. We have to adjust the platforms, the capabilities, the weapon systems that match where we think we're going to have to operate into the future.
What are the capabilities that the Marine Corps does not currently have that you would like to see them have?
Yeah. Some of them will show up later this year and into next year. One of the challenges for in a nation like the U.S. And I would argue our partners and allies is to make sure that the maritime choke points, if you will, the places where commerce flows through, and for all of us, that they're open, that they're held open, they're not controlled by anybody. So the ability to control, to hold open, to keep free a set of choke points, maritime choke points, means you have to have the tools to do that. You have to be able to monitor that. You have to be able to engage an adversary who wants to close it down. So we need things like anti-ship capabilities, the surveillance, the collection capabilities in a maritime domain that we don't have right now. We need the ability to move laterally, both by air and on the surface at a tactical level, with greater frequency and in smaller numbers than we do right now. But I would say beyond a piece of hardware, the most important part is the human part of operating in an austere, expeditionary, maritime environment without any developed infrastructure, but getting the job done and being able to transition quickly. If there's a crisis that happens, you can immediately transition to that.
I'd be interested in your perspective on our own modernization efforts here. We actually had commander of US Army Pacific out a little while ago, and I would not say this to him, but I'll say it to you, that in some ways I think the ADF is a little bit like the Marine Corps in terms of the mental equipment it brings to the job. I'd be interested in your views on that, but what's your read about how you see defence evolving here, and what does that mean in terms of our ability to cooperate more effectively?
Yeah. I heard an interesting framework, interesting but also very straightforward framework earlier today that I think goes a long way to answering that. In concentric sort of, perhaps not circles, but concentric arcs, homeland defense, and then a couple layers of standoff or an outer fence line sort of defense. And then wherever a crisis goes that Australia feels it needs to participate or needs to address due to their national security concerns, that's sort of the concentric layered approach. Well, this is same for us, not any different than us. And the way that the Marine Corps is built as a air and ground and logistics kind of task force, all organically, is a lot how the ADF is moving. How do you integrate all that? How do you operate as a single team? Well, this is how we're built by nature as a Marine Corps. So it's easy for us to work alongside somebody who's working to to develop, to refine the tactical and operational concepts that bring together the different capabilities from silos into a whole. This is what we do every day as a Marine Corps. So it's a natural fit for us to work alongside.
Some concepts which I understand the Marine Corps is working on through war games is now what they refer to as stand-in forces. And I've got it written down here, expeditionarily advanced base operations. Okay. Can you tell us what those things mean and tell us what they mean in the Australian context?
Sure. Stand-in forces is a notion, a concept where you assume that a stand-off alone approach is not adequate. In other words, staying outside the range of an adversary's collection and weapon systems, staying way out here, and then in time of crisis, moving in to address it is not a great approach. You need that, and you need the entire depth of operations. So the stand-in role for the U.S. Marine Corps is to remain forward persistently all the time with the partners that we have in the face of an adversary, to collect against them, to prevent them from collecting against us and other friendly nations, to be in a posture basically so that if something were to heat up, you're in the right position already. You're not fighting your way in. So it adds to the standoff. It creates an entire framework in depth and in breadth. This is the sweet spot. This is the natural role for the Marine Corps to be forward. We are expeditionary, we're amphibious. It builds on the competencies we already have. It's also a natural fit for Australia because the role that in my watching over the last several decades, especially in this neighborhood, the expeditionary, in other words, get there quick, don't need a lot of time. We'll sort it out when we get there. But we have the tools, we have the competencies to get there quickly. That approach, that mental part, the amphibious part, which Australia has and is expanding, these are all natural fits for us. So the stand-in force for us, back to our roots, be forward alongside allies and partners with the role of making sure that if something were to move towards a crisis phase, we would be already in a position to help. Expeditionary advanced space operations is a shift from the sort of FOB aspects, the forward operating base aspects in the Middle East. You establish a base, it's there for months, if not years. You fly in the water, you fly in the fuel, you fly in the food, and you just operate out of there sort of in a hub and spoke mode, which works in that environment, in a counterinsurgency environment. But in another environment where you have a competitor that's intent on expanding and disrupting sort of the natural framework that's there in terms of security, you want to be able to operate in an expeditionary manner from bases that you set up, tear down, displace, move to another one. You need to have that agility. And that's what part of expeditionary advanced space operations is, that skill set, is that competency.
So, General, is that the model for the future of ADF US Marine Corps cooperation? Is that how this is now going to evolve in coming years?
I don't know. I can tell you my approach. My approach, and partly being the beneficiary, frankly, of great advice from people like General Campbell. He can say it more clearly than I am. My approach is not to come here and say, here's how we do business. I need you to make these adjustments so that you can be like us. My approach is from the very beginning, because this is how I was taught, go there, listen to what the ADF wants to do, where they're going, and figure out how alongside them we can be good partners. It's not to come here with, here's how we operate. I need you to operate and like this, buy this equipment, and then we can work together. First step, where do they want to go? So that was my whole purpose today, is not to come here and tell them where we are. It's my purpose in spending all day today with the ADF is, where are they going and how can we be a partner in that?
I'd like to touch on Ukraine, and I guess in the context of lessons learned. I mean, we had, some of us at least, a sort of a model in our heads of what this new, highly sophisticated Russian military was, in theory, going to be able to do in Ukraine. And in fact, that has, I think, been completely exposed as something that's just not in the design of the Russian military now, certainly not how they think about warfare. And of course, Ukraine has surprised on the upside by, I think, being able to show a tremendous amount of flexibility in everything from strategic communications through to targeting, and they've done it exceptionally well. Yeah. What lessons would you perhaps point to from the experience of Ukraine so far, as might be relevant in the Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah. Probably not unlike most other military people. We're sort of amateur historians, not professional, but amateur. That said, though, I caution myself and others not to draw too many conclusions while a conflict is underway. You can misread things. It can be too close. So some lessons learned will take time, some distance, some context, because we won't know exactly why those decisions were made for maybe some time. But there are some near-term things I think we should pay attention to. Logistics, clearly one of them. relevant to this partnership between the Australia and the U.S. and operating in this region. Logistics, logistics, logistics. That is the limiting factor. That's the driving factor in how far and how fast you can go. It can't be the last thing that you plan. It needs to be that person, whoever's handling logistics, better be in the room from minute one. And you better listen. Or else you can come up with great plans, great schemes, and then say, I need you to support this. And he's going to tell you, well, probably not going to happen.
Can't be done. Yep.
You better go back and redraw. Logistics. Second one, I would say you highlighted it. I would say the incredible rapid progression of the power of information. And I'll just leave it there because there's 100 things you could take apart there, from cell phone reporting to the deliberate, intentional release of information to the power of an individual and what they choose to say. President Zelensky, for example, to his people, to Russia, to everybody else, the power of information today, I think, can't understate. Third part, I would say, there are things you can measure between two opposing military forces. You can quantify them, you can compare ranges, you can do all those things. The more difficult part, and sometimes the more telling part, is the realization warfare is a human endeavor. And part of the lessons learned is understanding the human element of that. You highlighted both sides. Why did the Russian plan not go probably according to the way they laid it out on paper? And what role did the human part play in that? From conscript soldier to most senior leader. Flip the script to the other side, the Ukrainian human side. Why? What should we be surprised? They're defending their home turf. Their backs are against the wall. Their families are in the basement. I mean, there's a human element there that goes beyond the 6-month to 2-year conscript from Russia that's like, I don't know why I'm down here. I don't know what we're doing here. I'm cold. I'm out of food. The human element is incredible. We should never underestimate that. We have a lot to learn on the human factor.
I mean, it's been gritty, but it's been smart. That's the thing that I like about it.
Absolutely been smart.
And, I think from an Australian perspective, I mean, I just offer this as my own observation, that sometimes I think we get so obsessed with the complexities of force modernisation that it can only be done with a Cray computer, and it's all so hard and it's off in the future. And, what the Ukrainians show is that if your backs are against the wall, you can do a lot.
Yes, you can.
You can do a great deal with some clever thinking about targeting and shop-bought drones. It doesn't have to be the most technologically advanced piece of kit that the world's ever seen.
I think they knew, Peter, from the very beginning, it would be a huge mistake to try to take Russia on symmetrically, force on force, head on head. Big mistake. So they wisely chose not to do that. They are operating as asymmetric as you can imagine, and it's working.
What lessons do you think the Chinese might be taking from this conflict?
I don't know. I have to believe they're watching. I have to believe that they're not just scratching their head, but they're deliberately, intentionally trying to draw lessons learned and figure out what in that theater in EUCOM in Europe applies out here. I don't know what lessons they will learn, but I would bet everything that, every dollar that I have in my flight, in my bag, that they're focused on learning, without a doubt, because they've been doing that for the last 15 years.
Looking more broadly beyond the combat phase, I think a lesson is really about the failure of deterrence from 2014 up until February this year, where the West made some bad decisions, in my view. One was, let's not arm the Ukrainians too much because that might become provocative. That leads me to want to ask you about deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region. Clearly we are in a strategic environment where people are now getting concerned about relatively near-term risk. What can we do collectively to strengthen our capacity for deterrence. And really, I'm talking a little bit in code here. It's really about what can we do collectively to stop China from, making the worst possible decision with regard to Taiwan.
First of all, there is a lot to learn or relearn about deterrence, in my view. My parents' generation, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they spent a lot of time thinking about deterrence. We're very good at it, in my opinion. We have to get to that level again because we have a pacing challenge. They had one too. They were forced to do it. Now we're forced to do it. We'll learn deterrence. First part of that, I would say, is breaking it down. It's not a binary black or white yes, no answer. There is strategic deterrence. There's a conventional level of strategic deterrence. There is the hard part, I think, that you're hinting at, which is deterring below a full-out warfight. That you could argue that the approaches that we've taken in the last 10 years are not working out here. They're moving forward. They're not picking a fight. They're achieving their objectives. We're not successfully deterring it because what some people call gray zone or whatever, however you want to call it, we haven't figured out quite how to stop that. In terms of Taiwan and the PRC's approach to reunification, their words, I would say first, you make it really difficult for them by, it's not PRC fighting against Taiwan. In other words, coalitions, networks, alliances, partnerships are a problem for them. We need to make that ironclad. We need to make that indivisible, literally. We need to provide Taiwan as much as we can to make themselves defendable in a manner that makes sense for them. And we're doing that, we're all doing that. And that isn't just ship arms there. That's actually, what's the concept? How are we going to make ourselves into a really, really difficult problem set? And then just communicating back and forth. And here, I think the sharing of information and intelligence between the U.S. and Australia that's the gold standard. Painting as clear a picture we have of their intentions, of their thinking, that level of open discussion, the sharing between the U.S. and Australia, I think that's the standard, that's the bar.
Thank you. Well, I think it's time to go to some questions from the audience. Good to see a few hands going up. I think what I'm going to do is give a gentleman of the press an opportunity first. There's a micro in the room. Can you please identify yourself, say where you're from, and then I'll come back with you.
General Berger, Andrew Green from the ABC. Welcome back to Australia. I want to refer back to 80 years ago and the 1st Marine Division in the Battle of Guadalcanal. A lot of lives were lost there. What concerns do you have about the very modern day developments in Solomon Islands? You're obviously keeping a close eye on what's being established there. Is that another example of the deterrence not working and the possible creeping forward or the moving forward, as you put it, of the PRC in this region?
Couple of thoughts. That's a great question. Probably some of you all have been to Guadalcanal, I suppose. If you have, like I have, you have a firsthand appreciation for, first of all, at the tactical level, the human part, how difficult, how tough, how challenging warfare is. I begin there because in the end, there are Marines and soldiers and service members who decide those conflicts and in the most challenging kind of conditions. And when you stand in the foxholes where those Marines were and you think, God, how did they hold on? How did they do that? It's an unforgiving terrain and climate, and yet they beat all the odds. What do you draw from there till today? A lot of things. First, in the end, although there's lots of books and arguments about stages and elements of that, It was a air, ground, naval. It was the challenge was putting all that together in a way that could defeat the adversary, and it worked. We didn't have jointness back then. We do now, in other words. Our approach to Guadalcanal, if it was in 2022, would be very, very different. We wouldn't be stitching it together on the fly. We know how to operate as a team now. The second part, I would say, is the allies and partners part of that. We're not going to have always the best view, the clearest picture. My learning over the 30, 40 years of coming here is humility is a really powerful tool. If we have to understand the neighborhood, and we're never going to understand it as well as Australia will understand it. So second lesson learned, listen to your allies and partners. They'll paint the picture not just of the terrain and the climate, but the culture, the people, the background, everything that you need to know when you're not a close-in neighbor, but you need to understand. Lastly, I would say just toughness, the endurance, when it's not going well and you need to lean on each other and your partners, that's when it pays off. The U.S. forces came here before they went north. This partnership dates to World War II and prior to that. Solomon Islands, geography, a lot of things change in warfare, not geography. Where the Solomon Islands are matters. It did then, it does now. Geography doesn't change. It's still strategic.
David, you're being kind about Australia and what we can offer, but something that the United States has offered to the Solomons, which I think is really valuable, is opening an embassy, which has now been announced when the Secretary of State was out here a month or two ago. And that is actually a really valuable contribution, because there are some occasions, because of history, that, it helps to have another partner there that can reinforce messages. So I think that's great.
I agree. A lot of us had to work for the last 2 years sort of virtually.
Yeah.
You can't have a virtual embassy. You can't have a virtual presence somewhere. You got to be there.
Indeed.
You got to be there.
Let's go to one question here and then the third question. So,
thank you. Daniel Hurst from The Guardian.
Daniel.
General, thanks for today. As has been well documented, the Port of Darwin is currently held under a 99-year lease by the Chinese company Landbridge. There's documented links to the PLA.
That's good.
What concerns, from where you sit, what concerns do you have about that? Does that in any way inhibit the cooperation between the Marine Corps and Australia? And sort of looking ahead in the next 5 to 10 years, will that be a barrier to deepening that relationship?
Not going to be a barrier, no. Here's how I look at it. If it's not a concern to Australia, then it's not a concern to me. We are here, we come to Darwin to train alongside the Australians in one of the premier places where we can really operate, train in a way that's difficult to do anywhere else. The status of the port, that's Australia's decision. And they've looked at the legalities of it, and this is their sovereign territory. So I don't have a concern. I would have a concern if Australia had a concern.
Were you consulted in the review recently?
No, I think that's a sovereign decision of the sovereign nation. I don't know what discussions might have occurred between the U.S. and Australia. I don't know. To answer your question specifically, was I consulted? No, nor should I have been.
Some of us are definitely doing our best to generate a sense of concern, General. There's no question about that. Can we go here?
General Krishani Danji from SBS News. If I may, could you provide more details on reports Kurt Campbell will be visiting Solomon Islands? And you mentioned there the importance of partnerships and trust within this region. Do you think that the fact that Solomon Islands are going to China with this security pact shows a failure of Western nations to properly engage with the Pacific?
In the same way that looking at Ukraine and drawing definitive conclusions while a conflict's going on, no, I wouldn't characterize it in specific terms, frankly, because there's not enough information in my head to draw that conclusion. And second, I think sometimes some things take time. Here's what it clarifies for me. In competition, in campaigning, you have to look at the bigger picture. Solomon Islands, their location matters. It's clearly a point of contention and competition. Here's a lens that I use. This is an example, another example to me of the PRC not just broadening, not just expanding, but the way that that happens and the consequences for the nations that they do it. We should illuminate. We should draw out into the open what this means long term. This is, in other words, an extension of, hey, we're here with a check. We're here with money, and we'd like to improve your port or your airfield or your bus station. And that just sounds so good until a year later, right? Or 6 months later. I think our role, in other words, is to draw things out into the open for a public view of it. Make sure that between us, the conversation is out in the open. But it's not for me to judge pass or fail. It does highlight the strategic location of places in the Pacific, for sure.
Do you have any details of Kurt Campbell's visit to Solomon?
I don't. I don't. Oh, no.
There's an interesting PRC playbook at work, it seems to me. We look at the Solomons because it's close by,
Yeah.
but something that got a little bit of media coverage here in Australia was the delivery of air defence missile systems to Serbia from China just in the last 72 hours or so.
Yeah.
Most particularly, even the way it was done, which was through 20 sort of airlifts of modern Chinese sort of C-17 knockoff aircraft. But it's kind of the same model. It's pick a small, fairly vulnerable society, make an unbeatable offer in terms of what a relationship could look like, and then move in as fast as you possibly can. And, it seems to me that we are going to have to sort of up our diplomatic military diplomacy machinery in order to be able to deal with those sorts of actions.
It's like probably, I don't know about you, but I mean, it's like my parents told me, if his deal sounds too good to be true, probably is.
Yes,
yeah. If it looks like a interest-free loan, okay, it's probably not.
Yeah.
If it looks like, and we're going to hire all the local labor pool, probably not going to happen.
Ben, you wanted to put a question.
General, thanks
Sure.
for your talk. Ben Packham with the Australian newspaper.
Hey, Ben.
You spoke just then. I'm going to do a two-part question if I could. You spoke just then about the long-term consequences of what we could see in Solomon Islands. I'm just wondering if we could go a little deeper with that. And secondly, just thinking about some of the changes you're making to the Marine Corps and the procurement cycle that's required for changes given the rapidly changing strategic context that we have. Is it okay anymore, do you think, to sort of look out in the distance at 10 years hence and do all your planning along that sort of a timeline? Or would you suggest that that needs to be contracted, and if so, what's a reasonable cycle?
Ben, can I just, the first part, the long-term impact of
the Chinese security agreement, which we believe that, which Prime Minister Sogavare says he intends to sign with Beijing?
The first one, I would, in all honesty, not qualified to answer. The long-term impact of that security agreement, I'm not suited to. The second question, certainly yes. Just to clarify, the notion of a force design is not a new one, and it's not peculiar to the military. It's an approach where I'm not teaching a class here, but we recognized that the year to year sort of refinements of the Marine Corps were not going to move us along fast enough. That is, those incremental adjustments that you make each budget cycle wasn't going to do it. So we took a step back. How far out into the future do we need to put a peg in the ground and say about there? And we picked a decade out. That's not our acquisition or procurement cycle. It's for us, it provides an aim point that's moving, because my horizon as a service chief is a 10-year running, that far out. That's my headlights. That's not our acquisition cycle. But if I don't think that deep, if we don't have some portion of a service thinking that deep, we won't be able to do the research and development, the access, and we won't be able to put the things in place now that will get us something in 8 to 10 years. So I had to think deep enough that gets us beyond the near-term budgetary personnel sort of churn with some unknowns out there a decade out that will make adjustments along the way. The arcane, your term, arcane procurement acquisition process, yeah, I don't think you would get any U.S. military person to say, I love our acquisition process. It's just so great. Especially now, as fast as technology is moving, it's difficult for our process to keep up. That said, though, we have to do some things better. I got to get gear, I got to get equipment in the hands of Marines as early as possible. Give them a prototype now. Let them take it to the field, break it, even though we're going to tell them it's indestructible. And actually, we're going to tell them two things. We're going to tell them, I'm going to give you a class next week on how to use it. And they're going to take a big yawn and go, well, I'll figure it out in about 2 hours from now. And then I'm going to tell them, it'll do these 4 things. That's what we spent 4 years working on. It's going to do these 4 things. And they're going to say, that's great. And they'll come back to me tomorrow and go, it does 2 of them. The other 2, it doesn't do at all. But we found another thing that it does do, because we took it apart and we put it back together, and now it does this. That's what we have to do. That speed of learning, of adaptation, we got to take advantage of instead of fight, instead of resist. You get tools in soldiers and Marines, sailors' hands early on. They don't need a training team to come and give them a 2-week class on it.
Just on that, so
Yeah.
when you see a capability gap, how quickly do you have to move in to address that with something that's fieldable?
Yeah, we have tools now, as of the last couple of years, given to us by law, by Congress, that allow us to move quicker. There are some rules associated with that, but we can go get a capability now, quickly, in smaller numbers, field it, as long as it's sort of ready to go right now. This isn't research and development. We're talking about it's kind of shelf ready to use. We have the ability to do that now, and funds to do that now. And I think the more we demonstrate that we can do that responsibly, then our Congress will give us more resources and perhaps broaden the rule set for it. But we have the tools now to move pretty quickly.
General, I'm going to guess that your Marines are as kind to capability developers as our diggers are. Anyone that's been out to the field knows that.
True.
We'll take a question from Marcus, then I'll go to you, Leslie, then Jack. And no, that's probably going to be it by then.
Hi, I'm Marcus Hellier from ASPI. I'm a big fan of your work, I have to say. Like, a lot of military organizations talk about agility and adaptability and transformation and change, but they don't actually do it. It seems like the Marine Corps under your direction is actually doing it.
Yes.
And when I look around for parallels or analogies, there's not a lot. Maybe what the Ukrainians have achieved in the last 8 years is kind of, one example. But, you're changing force structure, you're changing equipment, you're changing operating concepts.
Right.
And you seem to be achieving it. So I
Yes.
guess my question is, whenever you try and do that, there's always pushback, inertia, resistance. So how do you get buy-in, and how do you overcome those points of friction?
I would agree with you that there's inertia, bureaucratic, not obstacles, but our system is built not to change. Probably for good reason, because otherwise he took over next week and he'd take, the Marine Corps off hard to the right, and then next gal would take it all the way in another direction. So there's some value in not doing hard swings. That said, when you recognize you got to move and you have the logic behind you, there has to be an ability to do that. You're going to incur friction. We're making mistakes. We're learning quickly. We're learning what's not working. Two things I have going for me. One, really smart people around us that are willing to understand risk and take it. Second, I have bosses in our Department of Defense who are taking the risk alongside of me. Third, I have Congress. Congress historically looks at the military as wasteful, slow to change. So they are not rewarding, but they're acknowledging the move that the Marine Corps is making and the associated risk, and are giving us the resources to do it. My payback to them is I got to keep them informed. I got to tell them the things we've learned in the past 6 months, year. These things are not working. We're going to shift over here. So I have to keep them informed all the way, or they may think I'm going off the reservation somewhere. So my obligation to my boss and to Congress, keep them informed all the time. And be honest, be open. Tell them what's not working. But so far it's worked.
And what about the people who work for you?
People who work for me. Brilliant people, of course, that you're around. They're a lot smarter than I ever was. And I would say this is one of those times, the first in my career, but it's happened before, where especially the major and below, lieutenant colonel and below crowd, they recognize it too, and they are unleashed for the first time. In other words, I'm not telling them exactly what path to get on. I'm telling them you have to end up there. And I'm giving them the latitude to figure it out. They love that. They're actually going to determine the path, not me. You just got to unleash their creativity, their innovation, but you got to back them. You got to give them the top cover to make mistakes. And that's my job.
Is the drive this near peer competitor that has emerged?
And the near peer competitor, and the second part, I think, is the speed at which technology is changing.
Right.
Yes. That our normal process can't keep up with that.
Okay. Leslie.
Thank you very much, General. My name's Leslie Seebeck. I'm currently at large, is probably the best description for me. This is almost a follow-on from the discussion. There was a good lead in there. Thank you, Peter. When we're talking about enduring competitive advantage, of course, we're in a world of very tough competitive advantage, particularly on technology with major developments. Just, we can see or just on the horizon. What's the thing that concerns you most? That's the first part. And the second part is, what can Australia do to help or counter or meet those same challenges?
All right. Is your question along the lines of technology what worries me the most, or broader than that?
On technology specifically, and how it affects your ability to operate and your ability to exert projection and force.
2 or 3 things. First, the cyber vulnerabilities of every piece of gear that we have. That we didn't bake into it 8-10 years ago. We must now for obvious reasons. So we have to make that adjustment. We have, but that's the first concern, is that as fast as we develop something, if they can crack into it, we've wasted 3 years, in other words. We can't continue that cycle. So we got to protect it. We got to protect the intellectual aspects of what Australia and U.S. and others are developing. We got to keep that. Second, frankly, too narrow a view. And I'll be self-critical here. I think our limiting factor, in other words, is our own imagination, which is informed by our own experience. If I give that phone to somebody my age, she's going to tell me what it'll do. But if I give it to my son, it'll be times 5. Our limiting factor, in other words, is ourselves. Technology, understanding that it can actually be more than on the surface seems, that's the magic of it. Third, perhaps, in terms of technology is going in different directions and then trying to patch it together down the road. Whether that's a radio, a computer system, an F-35, we have to, at the speed at which things are moving, we have to think from the beginning, not later on, but from the beginning, can I talk to the Australian F-35 that I'm going to be flying with or not? I can't make a box for that 2 years from now. I got to think of it from the beginning. So I worry sometimes that we're going down individual paths, assuming we're going to somehow figure out a bridge later on that we'll just you'll plug your thing in and I'll plug my thing in and we can talk. That's not going to work. We got to think from the very beginning how we can operate, not just interoperate, but like as someone characterized this morning, interchangeable. That's a whole nother level. That's where we need to get to, interchangeable. Your unit or my unit, interchangeable. Not interoperable, interchangeable. By the way, ma'am, I love your characteristics. You're at large. I love that. Sometimes I think I'm right on the edge of being at large if my boss ever figured out tomorrow where I'm going.
Yep.
I might be at large too.
Me, I'm 2 weeks away from being at large. So you have to tell me how to do it, Liz. Jack, we'll go to you maybe for the last question, I think.
Sir.
Thank you, General. Jack Norton from here at ASPI. I just wanted to come back a little bit to Darwin and to Northern Australia to see, is there anything you've got in the works that you can divulge? I feel like obliged to ask that, but also where do you see the US Marine presence in Northern Australia in the next 5 years? Do you see perhaps more use of Australia's bare bases, upgrading of that infrastructure we're starting to see in WA, perhaps some more of that? Where do you see this going?
Yeah. I think the limits of that will be, as far as Australia wants to go, will allow us to go. We talked today about bare bases, which I'm familiar with, but not all U.S. military folks have ever heard of or understand. So first is we need to understand what they are and what they mean to Australia. The second, I would say, we're back to Darwin. Darwin does for us, selfishly, two basic things. It gives us a place to train at scale alongside a partner at a high end. You can use every tool in the toolkit and press things to the limits in terms of realism. It's awesome. It's great. And you're doing it with a partner that shoots the same howitzer that you do. She uses the same equipment. Thinks the same, talks a little bit different, but basically pretty much the same. That's incredible. The second part, though, which most people wouldn't necessarily talk about, people come into the U.S. military for a lot of reasons, but one of them is to travel, is to go to a place they would never. So Marines in California now, they are dying to come to MRF-D because it's Australia, and they're from Illinois, and Australia is like they want to see a part of the world that they wouldn't get to see. So, it has nothing to do with warfighting other than we need them in the Marine Corps, and this is part of what they came in for, to be part of something bigger than themselves and, frankly, to travel, to see a credible country. Across the rest of Australia, I don't know. I mentioned this morning to General Berger, I said, when I came here first, 7, 8, 9 years ago with one of the second, maybe rotation of MRF-D, everything was in Darwin. Couldn't leave Darwin, everything constrained to Darwin for good reasons, right? We're going to take baby steps here. I'm going to Darwin tomorrow morning. I'm going to ask them, where's everybody in MRF-D right now? They're going to show me a map of, I'm sure, people, Marines spread across Australia. That's awesome. Why? Because we're working now with all kind of different ADF units. If the ADF thinks that the bases in the Northern Territories, if they're worth utilizing in terms of training or operationally, we will be right there alongside them. Absolutely, yes. This is EAB, this is Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations. How do you move in, set up shop quickly, defend it, and then break it down 96 hours later? How do you do that? This is what we do. So if that's a direction that the ADF would like to go, either for training or for operational deterrence reasons, we'd be right there with them. because this is what we do.
So, General, something that I would love to see, and I think it's perhaps not too fanciful to imagine it, is that we see a Japanese self-defense force unit in Darwin as regularly as we're seeing your folk. Because really it seems to me that trilateral arrangement is the core of security in this part of the world going forward. And so, there'll be a lot of really wonderful symbolism to see if something like that emerge, I think, in future years.
We've done it already on ship, where I think the last time was probably on an Australian ship. But on each other's ships, we've had all three contingents of Marines and soldiers embarked on them. It's awesome.
Yes. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. We are at time, and I know you're off to the War Memorial now, so we can't detain you. But can I thank you, General, for coming and spending time, taking some tough questions from us. It's been a really great conversation, and anytime you're in town, please think to come to ASPI. We'd love to host you again.
Peter, I am very grateful for you inviting me here. Thanks. They weren't tough questions. They were good questions. That's good. Thank you very much.
Please thank General Berger. Thank you, sir.